Yeah, both are correct. I mean, as Michael Porter says, if you can't say what you don't do in an industry, then you don't have a strategy. But whatever choices you make is still an assumption. You still think if we do this, this will happen. That's not necessarily the case. That's what you assume when you prepare your strategy. It's your, I guess, you could call it best guess if you wish, but you always must be aware as you start to execute the strategy that you've got to keep testing those assumptions. So is this actually working? Is it wrong or is it partly wrong? Do we need to tweak it? Do we need to change some initiatives or projects, programs, whatever, in order to kind of stay on track to the ultimate goal of the strategy? There's two parts to that. Advanced data analytics is giving us much greater insights into how performance is working, how one set of activities impact another, and whether or not, what we think was going to happen is actually happening. With advanced data analytics, you can do diagnostic, descriptive, predictive. Like you can model cause and effect to at least strong correlations much better than we could in the past. To support that, you do need a good strategy governance process. Who's responsible for what, who does what, and a good strategy review process that's normally on a quarterly basis, where you're looking at the results from the ongoing analysis and making decisions about whether everything's working the way that you thought it was, or whether you need to make some tweaks. So the main point here is you need a very good governance process underpinned by very good strategy analytics. There will be people who will facilitate the process, but they won't be owners of the steps. If you're doing a balanced scorecard system, the objectives, KPIs, and initiatives will be owned by various parts of the organization. The role of the strategy office is just to ensure that process works according to the governance plan and is being adhered to. The important point there to make is that strategy departments, or whatever you call them, do not own the strategy. They're not responsible for the strategy. Yeah. They're responsible for helping to formulate the strategy and overseeing governance of implementation. One of the biggest reasons, causes of caution, if you will, is that organizations spend way too much time and energy in formulating the plans. And people get very protective about what they've recommended and that is being done. They don't like to see anything being perceived as failure. So there can be resistance to changing those assumptions because you've got a sense of ownership. That's why I always recommend doing a much lighter touch strategic plan and doing kind of good quarterly strategy reviews, update parts of it if needed. And that's part of the review process. Similarly, I don't think we need to do annual strategy refreshes these days. Strategy should not be time sensitive in the sense that, we can only really assess the assumptions once a year. And it's always worth remembering that when you've finished your environmental scanning, etc., that's a major input into the strategic plan, the world doesn't stop still for the next 5 years while you execute that plan. There'll be changes to competitive behavior. There'll be changes to customer requirements. There'll be geopolitical changes. And all this needs to be constantly monitored and taken into account as we implement the strategy, along with strategic risk. And that includes resilience planning. And, from a strategy point of view, a lot can happen to derail a strategy. Could be quite minor to industry specific or something like the pandemic. Nobody saw the pandemic coming, right? So you have to kind of see strategy as more dynamic and not a fixed event, if you will. That's part of what I would call continuous monitoring. I mean, you should always be looking out to the external world and what's going on. It comes back to my point about strategic analytics being increasingly important these days. And I think we'll start to move away from a reliance on key performance indicators and start to look more at what the analytics is telling us. Although there'll still be need, obviously, for measurement, but all measurement, whatever form, is backward looking. So, you're not really responding to the latest information, and that information and data will change on an ongoing basis. I now talk about the age of uncertainty. It's an age where it's becoming increasingly difficult to predict with a great deal of accuracy what's going to happen in the future. That's why I think it's important to do quarterly strategy reviews and put more reliance on that, because it's a bit like financial forecasting. It's a lot more accurate over the first and second quarter than, say, over the fourth, fifth, or sixth quarter. And you expect it to be. I still think there's a requirement to do longer term plans, whether it's 3 and 5 years, but switch the emphasis to the shorter term planning horizon and what we expect is going to happen over the next period, while still working towards those longer term plans. What's important is that you freeze the strategy for periods of time, then temporarily unfreeze to make any required changes. And the other part is that we have to accept that we live in an age of uncertainty, because we're now global. At the local level, you can be impacted heavily by events globally that are totally outside your control, like the energy price crisis we have in the UK, at least, and in other countries, that's caused by the war in Ukraine. And that, or another pandemic, or a global financial crisis, all these things are possible. But in a similar vein, there could be very local issues or industry-specific issues that happen that you can't properly predict. Once you accept that we live in an age of uncertainty, then you can start to think about planning in a different way. You still need to plan, of course, but you won't see it as being set in stone and be something that will always be a set of assumptions.